Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Book Talks with the Doorstep. I'm your co-host, senior fellow here at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also senior fellow at Carnegie. Welcoming tonight or this afternoon in Erich's world, Erich Schwartzel, who is the Hollywood reporter for the Wall Street Journal since 2013, and he's written this most excellent book with my usual notes and note-taking, Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. I have to tell you, I've been talking about this book for so long, and not a single person that I've talked to is the impact that China has had on Hollywood. I think that we're going to have a lot to talk about today, but I want to start out with very much what's going on in the world today, and noting that you did talk about the special relationship between China and Russia in the book, mentioning that a promotional event that you went to, actually a movie, The Mystery of the Dragon Seal, Journey to China, that was a joint Russian-Chinese movie. And then you go on to talk about some children's programming, from China and his friend Crash from Russia. I want to hear more about this because I think we're looking at a lot of tanks in the news, and are today talking about soft power and this relationship between China and Russia that I think is going to become increasingly important as the days go by and as the war in Ukraine continues. So can you start us off? First, welcome again, and start us off telling us about how you got to that premiere.
Well, thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here, and I'm so thrilled that you're starting with The Mystery of the Dragon Seal, because The Mystery of the Dragon Seal, which is a title I'll forgive most listeners for never having heard of, is a Russia-Chinese co-production that came out a couple of years ago. And I came across it in one of the more surreal days of my experience reporting this book. I was in Shanghai, and I had this routine every morning where I would go to the hotel to get breakfast, and I would read the Chinese state newspapers that were out for everyone to take for free. And that morning I had read a story about Vladimir Putin sending Xi Jinping ice cream for his birthday. And it was a very happy little feature about the two world leaders exchanging birthday gifts. Later that night, as part of the Shanghai Film Festival, I went to this kickoff promotional event for The Mystery of the Dragon Seal, which was a Russian-Chinese co-production starring Jackie Chan and former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. It is a movie as surreal as it sounds, not a critical darling or a box office darling, but it was an example of how you really can see, especially in China, geopolitical alliances forming and dissolving by where they are working with other countries on screen. It is not uncommon to see a Belt and Road country come online with China and immediately have a co-production treaty signed between the two countries to start making movies or TV shows together. And it was very much the case already in 2019 with Russia, not just in the case of a movie like The Mystery of the Dragon Seal, but as you said, there was this expo that I went to where a lot of producers and TV stations would go and try and sell their programming to other channels around the world. And I saw an advertisement for this animated show called Panda and Crash, which, as you said, was about a Chinese character who was a panda and a Russian animated character, I think it was a rabbit, named Crash. And it was about the two animals and their unique friendship. And it was being sold very blatantly by CCTV as an animated children's illustration of the special relationship between the two countries. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to take all the other countries that China had a healthy relationship with and find characters that they could hook up with Panda, and essentially then broadcast those films and those TV shows in those countries as a way of essentially introducing the idea that these two countries are friendly with one another to younger children.
I mean, it's fascinating that they're getting into the minds of young children. That is probably definitely something they learned from their relationship with Disney. And Disney features prominently also in your as an example of success as a cautionary tale, looking at what we're talking about today, China's soft power and from my perspective as a free speech advocate, can be detrimental impact on the United States. But maybe we can talk a little bit about Disney in China, riffing off of the animated characters of Panda and Crash.
Well, it's so appropriate because when I was talking to the sales rep about Panda and Crash, and he was explaining to me the sort of the metaphorical concept of these friendships forming, he said, imagine a panda and Mickey Mouse that could air in the US. Of course, the issue with that idea is that Panda is all about friendly relations with the other country. I don't think Panda and Mickey Mouse is going to be happening anytime soon. But you're absolutely right that Disney's arc in China really explains so much about the development of China's overall economy and its attitude toward American soft power. Because back in the 90s, in the early 90s, Disney executives were already scouting land for a theme park. They were already engaging in conversations to try and get the Disney Channel onto Chinese airwaves because they had two objectives. One was they wanted to diversify beyond the US. They still were a pretty domestically heavy business at that time. They wanted to have more international business, and they also knew, as most people did, that China eventually was going to come online and be a significant market and a place that they really needed to position themselves for growth. So in the early 90s, they start scouting things. In 1997, they have this more than a hiccup. They have this complete interference in their plans with the release of a Dalai Lama film called Kundun that Martin Scorsese had directed and Disney had released. The release of that film, that valorization of the Dalai Lama, gets Disney temporarily banned. The CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, has to go over and apologize to Chinese officials for making the film. If this feels like deja vu because of what would happen in the 20 years since, it's because this was essentially the first example we have of a Western company facing economic repercussions and then having to apologize to see those repercussions go away. And then as China's box office starts to grow, Disney starts to do phenomenally well because what do they make? They make family-friendly entertainment that the Chinese censors, by and large, are not going to take issue with. One interesting thing to your point, though, about the influence of young minds, though, is I think the Disney executives knew that they had a problem, which was that they were dealing with a country that had not spent the 20th century getting to know Disney characters. And they knew that their playbook relied on children growing attached to Disney characters. No child is going to beg his or her parents to take them to a Disney theme park if they don't know Pluto and Mickey and Snow White. So that was one reason why they were so keen to get the Disney Channel onto Chinese airwaves. Communist regimes tend to be rather prickly about what goes onto their airwaves, and they said, no way. So they actually came up with a different strategy, which was a string of English language schools called Disney English, which would teach English language to young Chinese children using Mickey Mouse and Pluto and Elsa and Nemo. And it served two purposes. It was a good business because a lot of Chinese parents wanted their children to learn English, and it also introduced these characters using the lesson plans.
I saw the picture in your book of Disney English, and to say it really freaked me out, your description of what went on, because I think you went by one day and you saw like characters kind of dressing up, and A is for, I don't know, you had some better examples in your book, but
well, you're right. I walked by because I had been told repeatedly by Disney executives that they never characterized it as a nonprofit, but they kind of pushed back on this idea that it was an advertising vehicle. And I walked by one day. It was the same trip to Shanghai, actually, a very surreal trip in retrospect. And the new Toy Story 4 was coming out that week. And when I walked by, I saw all of the teachers wearing were wearing T-shirts that said Toy Story 4 in theaters now. So it really did serve a couple of purposes. And to your point about soft power, I spoke to one teacher I have to say, a really sane guy, someone who knew this was as weird as it sounds. And he said that in his classes, he would have his students give themselves English names, as you often do in foreign language classes. And in almost every class, he would have one or two Elsas.
Well, that's
that being right.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, as you're laying this out, and so far we've really been looking at, you know, what American entertainment companies are doing in China to get into the Chinese market. And once they're there and the Chinese market and access to China becomes critical, can you talk a bit about the reverse impact, which is not what young Chinese are seeing from American entertainment, but to the extent to which that begins to influence what Americans are seeing. And you talked about the Kundun experience, which in many ways I think was the start of this process of uh, well, in order to be able to get into the Chinese market, what Americans see in America, the films and TV programs that are going to be released have to clear the bar. Not just, well, the Chinese censors will cut a few things out, but the unreleased version will be, or sorry, the uncut version will still be shown to American audiences. Can you give us a sense about the extent to which American entertainment companies start to internalize Chinese, mainland Chinese norms about acceptable topics, and how is this an organic evolution? Is it in fits and starts? Is it trying here and there? But I mean, to what point do we get to where we are today in by the 2020s, where American entertainment companies that want to be able to have content viewed in China more or less are acceding to these red lines as to what and what are not acceptable topics.
Right, Nick, you really hit on the key distinction here with China. I think, studio executives, when I would talk about this, would often say, well, we censor movies for all kinds of markets. We censor movies for airplanes. And there's a key distinction here, which is that China's operating on a scale that allows it to censor films not just before they're released in Chinese theaters, but before they're released anywhere in the world, meaning that no Hollywood studio can make a movie that is critical of China or that presents it in a bad light without facing some kind of repercussions elsewhere. And this can come up in a number of different ways. So if, let's say, Universal decides to make a movie about Tiananmen Square, well, suddenly Universal might see its other movies not get released
Yes.
into the Chinese market. And I would take it even a step further. And this is one thing that Disney learned with Kundun, which is that it also can start to jeopardize much larger holdings. So Universal makes a movie about Tiananmen Square, and suddenly that theme park they just built in Beijing is called into question, and whatever other holdings the parent company Comcast might have to consider in China are called into question. And this is not speculation. This is what has happened over the production of a movie. Again, the critical point being over the production of a movie that was never going to be shown in China at all. And there are very, very few historical examples of markets that have been able to do that. One is the Nazi Party in the 1930s before the U.S. entered the war. They operated very similarly, and I think it's a very savvy strategy, because it ensures not just that your people see what you want them to see, or what you or they don't see what you don't want them to see, but also that the American film, which remains this global product, becomes something of a de facto commercial for you and avoids any criticism of you in other countries all around the world.
Yeah,
I mean, I think
go ahead, Tatiana. Sorry.
I think it's really blatant, and we should talk about is this idea that all of a sudden you don't have Chinese villains. And that really got to me, so let's make our villain from North Korea. And there's countless examples that you give time and again for those who are film buffs who know many of these films, the idea that your villain cannot be Chinese anymore. And China is part of China, and you can't say that it's not. And depending on what's going on in the world, you're going to now know that you're going to not say these things. And so it's this idea that before you even try to market the film, yourself. You're saying, well, no, we can't possibly talk about this or this issue. And I'm just wondering what happens now. So if China and Russia ally, so now we can't have Russian villains either. At what point does China look or assume the interests of others like a Russia, or to your point, as you write in the book, China is only looking out for itself? Do you have that sense?
I think it's a great question. You're right, because basically, as China's geopolitical alliances grow, its priorities are going to grow when it comes to what kind of narratives it sees on screen. You're absolutely right. I think if we saw more of a Russian-Chinese alliance, certainly any film that might portray Russia in a bad light wouldn't get into Chinese theaters. Right, there would be that kind of consideration as well, and so I think that is what you have to watch, because you're right. It's basically the Hollywood studio system has had to ingest the priorities of the CCP, and obviously there are the three T's that everyone knows to avoid: Tiananmen, Tibet, and Taiwan. But then it gets murkier when it's more about the portrayal of the world order or the portrayal of China affiliated countries. I think you're absolutely right, and I'll break it down into this kind of there's, I think, a bit of a micro example here, which is, you're right that there are no Chinese villains anymore. There hasn't been a movie put into production in more than a decade with a Chinese villain by a major studio. But beyond that, there's an example I have in the book of a James Bond movie, and there's a scene that they filmed in which James Bond has to break into an office building in Shanghai, and he shoots and kills a security guard. Well, that moment with this anonymous security guard had to be cut from the film because it made China look weak. So we're dealing with a country here that is working on a granular detail to scrub any negative portrayal of itself. So you can imagine if this is a country that's on guard for how you represent Taiwan or how you represent Tibet, certainly then there's going to be sensitivity around how you portray their friends and allies too.
We had a comment in the chat that we didn't know, they didn't realize that was in Skyfall, but there's so many examples in the book, and I urge our audience, A, to ask questions, and B, to read the book. So many examples of movies being scrubbed, of flags, there was a movie, now I'm not remembering the name of it, where to change the flag to a North Korean flag, that all of the efforts were crying because the move, how do you get the movement of the flag in the wind, and how do you change all of but this is real stuff happening right now today that I don't think most American audiences realize. And I'm going to have to read this question because this leans into this question of, on the U.S. side, what is the risk of audience outrage in the West here, boycott of Hollywood movies being too cozy with China? Do you think there's any risk at all of Western outrage?
Well, I think that it's been interesting because a lot of the examples in my book, like let's use this Kundun example from 1997. When China was pressuring Disney over the release of this Dalai Lama film, there was concern in the creative community that Disney would just kill the film. And they would say, Martin Scorsese, pack your bags, we're not releasing this film. And an open letter was written and signed by Spike Lee and Barbra Streisand and a bunch of other folks saying, just FYI, Disney, we're going to be really mad if you kill this film. I have to imagine if there was a similar situation today, the signatories to a letter like that would be far shorter, because there are so many people, and it's so clear that crossing China can turn you radioactive from getting work in Hollywood, because no one will want to associate. Radioactive is the word, because everybody wants to sort of keep a distance from anyone who has fallen out of favor with Chinese authorities. That being said, I think that we have some more recent examples, and the NBA example over the demonstrations in Hong Kong comes to mind most clearly, where there has been bipartisan outrage at what is seen as any kind of acquiescing to the Chinese authorities. It's remained in a political realm. It does not seem to have crossed over into the consumer realm. It's interesting. I mean, right now, Disney, since we're talking about them, they're in the middle of this political firestorm here domestically with this "Don't Say Gay" bill in Florida, and their response to that. And what's been curious to me is anytime it seems now Disney opines on domestic policy, a very quick response, often on the right, is yes, but how can you opine on American politics while you're still supporting and still funneling billions of dollars of investment into the CCP and China? And so I see it percolating, but I think this has happened largely out of sight, out of mind, and I think one reason that putting all the examples together in the book has been powerful is because a lot of it was happening in a context where I don't think it was seen as aiding and abetting an enemy. And now, in retrospect, so much of the censorship and so much of the self-censorship that Hollywood has done over the past 2 decades looks like it was just really helping give rise to China's power. And that, frankly, Hollywood was completely hoodwinked.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking, as you were commenting earlier. I mean, just thinking about some things in popular culture. Obviously, the terrible Red Dawn remake was made even worse by the fact that the story doesn't make sense once they become North Koreans. But even when you watch it, which I don't recommend anyone does. But if you do, you can even see that even in post production, they didn't scrub all of the Chinese elements out, or they didn't get everything. But it was clear that someone said, "Hey, this movie is not gonna fly with Beijing." Not even if it doesn't get broadcast in Chinese theaters, but just simply as you said that this could affect other equities. And the question about Disney, and I can't help but remember the before The Simpsons as a property were acquired by Disney, the one episode where they deliberately crossed the 3 T's, where they have the crack about, Mao, what a sweet little angel who killed 60 million people. Tibet used to be independent. They had the Tiananmen Square. Nothing has ever happened here. And you just can't imagine that they would do that now. For that. But is there a counter reaction happening? And I realize that we're speaking about Hollywood as a business, which may indicate not. But are there going to be studios emerging, new independent studios that say we will forego wanting to be shown in Chinese theaters in order to have a smaller market share, but to have complete artistic freedom, and actors and actresses that will and producers and directors that will say we don't want these restrictions? Or is this really a case of a billion eyeballs in China, with your movie perhaps shown there, are always going to outweigh 300 million eyeballs in the United States?
Right. I mean, I think the hurdle there is you might be able to find a smaller production company, an independent production company that wants to explore these ideas, but it's going to be very hard to cast a film like that because um, actors have seen and this is another, frankly, it's another playbook out of Nazi Germany. They've seen how an infraction, a years old infraction, can come back to
Yeah,
haunt you. And so the clearest example we have of this is Richard Gere,
yeah,
who in the 1990s started to become really the world's most famous supporter of Tibet
yeah,
outside of the Dalai Lama. Interrupted the Oscar telecast in 1993 to
yeah.
talk about human rights abuses. Um, I mean, bringing politics to the Oscar podium before it was cool, I guess,
Yes.
um, and really paid a price. I mean, his career hummed along, and he was given major roles. And then, as China's box office started to grow in 2008, he became, as I said, radioactive to studios. And when I started out on the book, it was a big question I had was, was his career killed by China? And because you would get different different opinions. And then I did talk to a casting executive at Warner Brothers who told me that the idea was, it's not like a list went around, there was no memo, but think of the risk assessment, right? If you really need to get Richard Gere, let's have a conversation. But otherwise, if you can get someone else, just get someone else, right? And I think when you break it down to that kind of individual level, right, where it's like, well, if we can get Jeremy Irons on the line, let's just get Jeremy Irons on the line, because it'll just be an easy, there won't be a question. We won't need to worry about this thing having any hiccups in China, and we can move on. So you can see how in some ways, frankly, if you put yourself in those shoes, it becomes a pretty easy call.
I mean, I see the motivation from Hollywood side, right? We want to make money. I mean, it's very money driven. Keep the politics out. Let's make money. But you know, when you're looking at the actual numbers, and if you look, you trace the history, like the original deals after the WTO weren't that many movies allowed to be in China. And then even after Xi and Joe Biden had their great rapprochement on, it wasn't that many more movies either. I'll let you explain to the audience that the movies allowed in China, by this quota isn't really that many considering how much is made. Isn't that right?
Well, it doesn't sound like a lot. It's about 30. It's supposed to be around 34 films a year. But there are 5 major studios, and they all have somewhere between 3 and 6 movies that really make or break their year. So one of the phenomena that fed into China's leverage over Hollywood was that the movies started getting much bigger and more expensive. As everything at the multiplex became a comic book adaptation or a franchise film like a Fast and Furious movie, these are movies that really sometimes, frankly, to turn a profit, have to make $1.2, $1.3 billion at the global box office. And it's really hard to get to those numbers without China. And it's really hard to make your numbers at the end of the year if those 4 or 6 movies don't work. And so it's 34 films a year, which is a fraction of the number of American films released, but it all but guarantees that if they try, the major studios can get their biggest, most important titles into the country. And so that was one thing. And then the other was that there was just this broader corporatization that started happening. And these studios that at one point may have answered to family offices now answer to much larger corporate entities. And so feeding bigger and bigger returns to the corporate gods became a bigger priority. And then the other 2 things I'd throw in the pot were the completely collapse of the DVD market, which it's hard to remember now, but about 15 years ago really kept the lights on at a lot of studios. And the fact that movie going in the US started to flatline around 2008 as well. So there was growth in China. And it was a place where if you played your cards right, you could get, 4 or 5 movies in there, and suddenly you're looking at, maybe $800-900 million in grosses you weren't counting on before.
So that explains the American. So let's go to the Chinese side, which I think is also an interesting story. They're looking, as you explained, to become part of this global community, right? To get Russian, to build that Disney, in China, to have those theaters, and I think to get idea that they have this creative ability, they may even win an Oscar, right? They're going to be part. I mean, it seemed that was the trajectory that they wanted, right, to follow and to get to. But it seems to be from the book, and tell me if I'm wrong and let me know what you think, that Xi upended all of that.
I think you're right. I mean, there's always been this push and pull between China's entertainment ambitions, between the economic motivation and the political motivation. The movies since Mao have served a very overt political purpose in China and have really been expected to serve as an arm of the state. And that started to have a little bit of tension around the early 2000s into the 2010s because China's box office started growing at a clip and its film industry started to commercialize. So suddenly you had Chinese movies being made that weren't just medicinal propaganda features, but they were movies like you'd see in any other developed market in the country. And obviously, fantastic for theater owners, fantastic for the malls that house these movie theaters, fantastic for the actors and the apparatus of celebrity that could form around it. Um, and then under Xi, as we saw him do with so much of China, he really brought the film industry underfoot. And it's still quite commercial, still very possible to make a lot of money in Chinese movies, but there's much more of an expectation that they will serve almost as in a Maoist way, that they will serve the state, and that when called upon, actors will be expected to do their part by whether that's by starring in a Chinese propaganda film or endorsing some state initiative. And we saw this most prominently with the crackdown that came after the backtax scandal. Whenever there was a massive crackdown, most famously with a major Chinese star named Fan Bingbing, where the CCP went in and essentially audited its entire entertainment industry and got all these back taxes paid back to it, and that really seems to have given the party license to play a bigger and bigger role. And it's no coincidence that some of the production companies that were busted in that tax scandal very soon after announced plans to make some movies about the Belt and Road Initiative or make some movies in response to some kind of national holiday. There's always been a currency system in Chinese entertainment, and it functioned as a little bit of a one for you, one for me model where, Tatiana, if you want to go make a commercial film and make a bunch of money, that's great, but you might be expected to next year make a movie about the founding of the PLA or the CCP or Mao's birthday, something like that. It just feels like that currency system, though, the Chinese authorities now have more of a say in how you build and spend that political capital.
Yeah. Can I ask a bit about not just about the political capital, but the intellectual and creative capital and the role that Hollywood has played in transferring that, and whether or not we will reach a point where Hollywood is no longer necessarily in the driver's seat for some of these projects? Because one of the things, I mean, I think we've seen this in a variety of film markets around the world, that at the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s, Hollywood just stood head and shoulders above everyone else in terms of production values and special effects, storylines, the glitz and the glamour, and you could always tell when that film industries from other countries were generally second or third best, and only if they could work with the Americans, they might get that jump. But is there a point at which the Chinese film industry will have achieved sort of critical mass and will have such attractive power? You've already mentioned, for example, Schwarzenegger going over to be a part of the Dragon Seal project. Is there a point at which the Chinese film industry will have learned all of these lessons from Hollywood, have improved their production values, and then make it attractive for American and Western talent to work, to say, look, I'm going over to work in China because that's where it's at now? Is there a sense that that may happen, or do you think what she and others have done have maybe put the limits on that? But the sense that American film stars and production talent may decide to accept a Chinese deal and integrate with their film industry.
It's happening to some extent. I think, with apologies to Governor Schwarzenegger,
Yeah.
it's still something of a C-list
Yeah.
crowd that's heading over for work there. But you're right. I think Chinese filmmakers and Chinese producers, they really targeted this in a specific way, because much like there's like as we see with so many Western sectors, there has been a deliberate technology transfer when it comes to the entertainment industry. And you might ask, well, technology transfer with airplane blueprints is pretty easy to understand, but how exactly do you transfer the technology of storytelling? And it's happened in several different ways. One of which is what you're describing, Nick, where there will be the deliberate recruiting of entertainment workers from the U.S. to Hollywood or to China. So that might mean that a stunt choreographer, a lighting designer, a hair and makeup person, someone who's known as what they call below the line workers might go and work on a Chinese crew. That's happened for the past, probably decade or so. And then there's a step up from that, which is hiring writers and directors to go over and help punch up scripts, introduce certain kinds of Western storytelling devices to Chinese scripts. I have a story where there's a guy by the name of Bruce Fierstein who, this guy's coming up a lot. He wrote 2 James Bond movies, and he was then hired to go over and produce a romantic comedy in China. And he was on set one day, and he was with the star, this like kind of hunky 30-year-old Chinese guy. And the premise of the movie was that this guy's wife had left on a work trip. And there's a scene where the husband whose wife is away is having just a mild flirtation with the maid. And the actor got in a huff, and he said, a man of my stature would never flirt with a maid. And the producer took him aside and he said, "Do you know who that maid is?" And the actor said, "No." He said, "That maid is every woman in the audience who wants to be with you." He said, "This is not about reality, it's about hope." And he explained that, whenever it comes to storytelling, there has to be that kind of audience surrogacy. Now, the kind of thing that certainly some Chinese filmmakers have grown to understand, but that Hollywood really mastered over 100 years. And so that kind of technology transfer is certainly happening. I think the relations and the global standing of China has no doubt made it harder to do. And I think, I imagine that decision by Schwarzenegger to go over and make a Chinese-Russian co-production today would be very different. Yeah. I think what's interesting, though, is it seems like China's really, especially for the past 5 years or so, grown to understand that it's a very big world out there, and that even if you don't engage the West, whether on a behind the scenes or on the big screen matter, that there are other markets where you still could.
Yeah, and just to finish out that, is there a sense that China may want to make movies not even for largely domestic audiences, but as you said, for the rest of the global market, which may appreciate having a choice of, we just don't have to take the latest Hollywood offering if we think that there's a good Chinese-made alternative, even if it doesn't have a primarily Chinese cast to it. Do you think that could be a direction that they would move in? And
I think it's happening in a way that I think most Americans would be shocked to learn of, and I think it's mostly happening through the Belt and Road Initiative and the cultural complement that they are trying to form. And also to your point, Nick, think about living in some of these countries where affiliation with the U.S. is shakier than ever. And China has appeared seemingly overnight, building train stations and ports and giving out COVID vaccines and all sorts of things. It might make sense that the entertainment would follow, or that it would at least function as a bit of an introduction to the country that has appeared in your backyard. And I saw this most prominently on a reporting trip to Kenya, where obviously there's been a ton of Belt and Road Initiative investment, but there's also a massive satellite dish initiative called the 10,000 Villages Project that a Beijing-based company is undergoing, where they are handing out low-cost satellite dishes to 10,000 African villages across the continent. And they carry all sorts of global entertainment, but they also carry a lot of Chinese entertainment and a lot of Chinese news and reality shows and soap operas. and they're subsidizing the entertainment in a way because these satellite dishes cost far less than the Kenyan alternative. So that's kind of helping them get their foot in the door. But to your point, I think the other thing that they have going for them is a lot of these countries do not want to import Western entertainment for all sorts of reasons. One of which is I met with the film minister of Kenya on this trip, and he's an incredibly socially conservative politician. I mean, makes Ted Cruz look like a harlot. I mean, just absolutely the most socially conservative politician you can imagine. And he said to me very clearly, he said, I love importing Chinese entertainment because it's already been censored for me. And I don't need to worry about these Western values seeping into my culture. And to Tatiana's point, and infecting my children's brains with his big thing was homosexuality.
Yep.
He said, I don't want any of these sort of homosexual themes to come into my country if I can help it.
Yeah, and we saw what China has done with the re-release of Friends, of scrubbing out, a lot of what they consider objectionable content, this time around. So,
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, and in your book, they're aiming for like a PG-13 rating, right? No sex, no curse words. It's a very and no extreme violence. So some of these movies that we're even talking about, some scenes are completely cut out. For being too violent, which is so interesting because I know a lot of artists. I teach at a school with a big film department, and and they may be idealistic, but if I told them to cut something for a censor in China, I think they would be up in arms. But I guess you get to a certain point where if you want to roll in the money, you say, okay, it doesn't matter. I mean that's the sense that I get from completing the book. There's a sense that the market's too big. I'm going to do whatever it takes, even if it compromises my ethics. And so since we're the Carnegie Council for Ethics, and we kind of look at ethical responses, has there ever been a discussion of ethics here in Hollywood and in the film industry, ethical compromises that are being made?
Well, to your point about directors, there are only really a handful. I can think of maybe 3 to 5 directors powerful enough to push back on the China cut, because it's ultimately the studios say what they do with it, and I've heard varying responses. I've heard some directors say, look, I'd rather my movie be shown in an altered format than not shown at all. I've heard others say, just don't tell me what you're doing to it, and and sort of close their eyes and look the other way. And then I have heard of examples. Christopher Nolan is one example, and of directors powerful enough to say, no, I'm not changing a frame, and if that means the movie's not going to get into China, then so be it. But I think in terms of the ethical conversation, it's interesting. I would notice a distinct difference between interviews I was doing with current studio executives and those who had been out of their job for a time. And I think the key distinction was it seemed like those in the job, as I said, they tend to have quite a few responses to any pushback on why they might be agreeing to this kind of censorship. And it goes beyond just the money. As I said, it usually falls along the lines of it's a market reality. This is what we need to access this market and to access these fans. That's what we'll do. And I think if you're talking to someone who might be a little less charitable, they might say, look, I have a fiduciary duty to shareholders to make as much money as possible, and this is what I have to work with. But then there often is, I think, almost like a what's that word when you leave a cult and you're
deprogrammed. Yeah.
Deprogrammed. Yes, thank you. There's almost like maybe a deprogramming that can sometimes take place too, where after the fact, they'll look at me and they'll say, man, I really feel like we got played. Like we just sort of rushed in, with blinders on and agreed to everything. And I think right now, especially with this past month and the Ukraine and these questions about the future of the West and Western values, I think there is a real sense of anxiety among studio executives about a legacy issue here. You know, will all of this censorship and acquiescing be remembered as being on the wrong side of history when it comes to standing up for Western values and standing up for free expression?
Yeah, I think we've had some comments coming through about precisely that, the idea that in an earlier age, Hollywood studio executives saw themselves as shapers of the American dream. They were the ones projecting American values, and precisely that question of how will their legacy be maintained. But connected to that, we've talked a lot about China's red lines: no Taiwan, no Tibet, no Tiananmen. The Chinese cannot appear to be weak, so on and so forth. Has there been any uh, indication that China has ever tried to encourage American studios to, in developing projects, to kind of push or support kind of Chinese communist perspectives? For example, I'm just thinking a number of years back, I watched the Chinese version of Top Gun. Or
Mm.
it's supposed to be the Chinese equivalent, right? And Maverick is not a Maverick because he's a guy who plays by the book, and team. He's not a guy who bucks the team. He supports the team, and carries out the discipline of the party. Is there any sense that those kinds of themes of, hey, autocratic rule, democracy is messy, you want a harmonious society, that there's ever been an attempt by the Chinese to encourage American filmmakers to introduce those themes into movies, or is that a bridge too far for China? They can censor, but they can't. And why I'm asking that is, I'm struck by what you describe as something really what we saw with the Legion of Decency in the 30s to the 50s, where they could impose cuts. They could say, you will not do certain things, but that also they could push certain storylines. And really, in the
Mm.
1950s, this wave of very particularly pro-Catholic movies. Priests are good guys, nuns are selfless people. On the waterfront, and Boys Town and Going My Way. That there was even an effort to say, not only do we want you not to show sex, show violence, show immorality, show divorced people, but we even want you to go ahead and do some is there an equivalent there, or has China mainly just been able to keep certain things off the screen, but they have not been able to say, hey, do a film about a harmonious win-win society led by a benevolent party leadership?
It definitely occurs. I think it usually occurs in a way a little bit different than you're speculating, and it usually happens because of some kind of financial stake in the film. One example from a couple of years ago was there was a movie released about the Battle of Midway that a Chinese firm co-financed. Now, why might they be interested in a movie about Midway, right? Well, think about China's relationship with Japan, and that will tell you everything you need to know. And there's also a scene that takes place in China that really presents, to be generous, a very one-sided view of China and the Japanese soldiers of World War II. That was an American-made film, and certainly something that they I don't know, I don't think they necessarily came to Hollywood and said, hey, a Battle of Midway script would be fantastic, but by attaching themselves and giving um, a financial stake, they have some say over it. The strongest example that comes to mind, though, was in 2014 with the fourth film in the Transformers franchise, which was a movie that really became this kind of fascinating case study in how many ways can you try to appeal to the Chinese market. And Paramount very strategically said, this movie is going to make more money in China than it will in the US. Let's do everything we can to just wring that market for everything it's worth. And they had to do certain, they had, in order to get certain guarantees, they had to share the script with authorities. And the authorities came back and said, the script looks great. There's one change we want to make. At the end of the film, when the giant robots are destroying Hong Kong, we want Beijing to come to the rescue before the Americans do. And so when you watch the film, not sure if I would say I recommend you do, but if you watch the film, there's a very random moment in this final climactic battle when there's the Hong Kong skyscrapers are being destroyed, and we somehow, for some reason, cut to Beijing and are introduced to the defense minister, who says Beijing will protect Hong Kong at all costs. Fighter jets are on the way. Now this is 2014. And then to watch that scene and to think about that request and that script change 5 years later, when Beijing's designs on Hong Kong became clearer and clearer, you start to see how these American movies became these kind of unwitting accomplices in much larger priorities and much larger goals.
Yeah, and one of the sentences you have in the book is that it's because American studios think in stock market quarters and China thinks in centuries. And I think this idea that they're trying to put together films and create an industry of their own. Nick, you talked about technology transfer, and you have so many great examples in the book of how they've developed their own industry, kind of like the Bollywood of China. Like it's there, they have it. And so we have a couple of questions in the chat, because I do want to get to some questions, and please put your questions in. We'll try to get to them, and we'll get Erich the rest of your questions. Maybe you can tweet back some answers.
Sure.
But what are you, in terms of their own industry and just kind of going after their own industry and doing, and forgetting about this idea of their Oscar, because their great big Oscar could have been last year with Nomadland, and they decided not to own it because of the director kind of her own thing. It seems to me they've kind of given up with the West, and they're like, okay, we have our industry, we've learned everything, we can make money, and we are now going to go into the Kenyas of the world, into our Silk Road partners, and that's where we're going to create our own space, our own ideology. Do you feel that they're there, and that's where we're at, that they've just taken off with their own industry?
That is where we are right now, where it seems like the exporting is still that last leg that is a big question mark. But you're absolutely right that the Chinese market, which is now #1 in the world, we knew it would be #1 in the world eventually, but then COVID really accelerated that, because Chinese theaters reopened so much faster than American theaters, and a culture of movie going has returned to China faster than it has to the US. It is not uncommon for a Chinese-made movie to make $600 or $700 million in China alone. Again, key difference being that's about 99% of its gross. It doesn't really make money. Chinese movies really aren't making much money in other parts of the world. But in terms of a domestic market, China's is very robust. We've seen in the past year, Chinese authorities tend to have been putting up walls and blocking the release of more and more American films. I think that's I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is probably relations between the two countries. And the other is that they want to make sure that they can preserve as much of that box office for their own films as possible. And the other is that as Chinese films have gotten better, and this shouldn't have come as a surprise, but it did, but as Chinese films have gotten better, Chinese audiences have grown to prefer them.
Yes.
Right, and their narrative. So look, to get to the narrative question, because that was one of how we started off, this idea of soft power. There's a point in your Kenya chapter where you talk about, and you ask the one of your interviewees, so what is your takeaway from this story? And it was something about, well, the Chinese are good and the Americans are bad. And do you see that narrative is really playing out more? It seems that from your reporting, they're doing more and more of that kind of storytelling, where America is now the villain.
Right. I mean, this is the ultimate irony and I think maybe one of the ultimate frustrations for a lot of folks working in this space is that Hollywood has spent the past 2 decades scrubbing Chinese villains from its movies, and China has just cast America as the bad guy over and over again. And the movies are not subtle. There's the most famous example that I'm sure many of you have heard of, Wolf Warrior 2. The film that gave us that coined the term Wolf Warrior diplomacy. Think of it as China's version of Rambo. Well, the bad guy is an American mercenary named Big Daddy, and when the villagers in Africa try to call the American embassy for help, they get the answering machine. And it's, as I said, it's not subtle. And I think what was particularly fascinating, and to our earlier point about really politicizing his film industry, is that in 2018, 2019, when tensions between Trump and Xi and the trade war really ratcheted up, China put into production a ton of movies, big blockbusters about the Korean War. Why the Korean War? Well, think about who looks bad in those narratives, right? And the highest grossing films in any market last year and this year so far were both Chinese propaganda films about Chinese victories in the Korean War. So you're right. And I had this moment where I befriended a guy in his 30s, when I was doing the book, and I talked to him recently after he had gone home to his hometown for Chinese New Year. And he was telling me how when he was a kid growing up, he watched CCTV, but CCTV would also carry some Western entertainment. And when he went home to visit, a lot of the younger children in the neighborhood were watching these cartoons and these movies about Chinese soldiers killing American soldiers. And he asked himself, he said, what will their attitude toward America, toward the West, and about China be when they're my age? What ideas will they have about China's place on the world stage because of the entertainment that they have ingested? And I think people who have grown up in America know more than anyone, perhaps, just how important and how powerful that those images can be.
Absolutely, and those images start as we started the conversation from a very young age, and including the narrative of the history and all of. We had, a question about Mulan that I want to end with. A question about how much Hollywood needs China, which is the discussion that today. So reminding everybody, we're talking to Erich Schwartzel about Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. It's a great book. And maybe a final comment on Mulan and Hollywood and what Hollywood is going to keep doing. What is your prediction over the next 5 years? More collaboration, less collaboration, more Mulans of the world?
I think we'll see. I mean, China's leverage isn't going anywhere, I don't think. But I think we will see less collaboration, and Mulan is one reason why. I know for certain that whenever Disney executives got together and said, let's make a new Mulan, they were thinking, oh my God, what a no-brainer. This is going to be insanely successful in China. What they failed to see, and this is great because it sums up so much of what we've been talking about, is that by the time the new Mulan was released in China, Chinese audiences had been ingesting Chinese-made movies about Chinese narratives, right? There was no need to go see an American version of a Chinese myth. Would we expect American audiences to go see a Chinese-made version of Davy Crockett, right? There was just a complete miss there. And then the other thing that I think happened there was not only was there the controversy over Disney filming in Xinjiang province and the political blowback that inspired, and then the burying of the film that it forced Chinese authorities to do when it was released. But there was also quite a bit of criticism on a grassroots level over the film getting historical inaccuracies wrong. The design of the homes reflected a different dynasty than the one that Mulan was living through. And I think it taught Hollywood that there are so many tripwires when it comes to portraying China, working with Chinese-born people, that I think that there will be less collaboration, because I think it's proven so unpredictable what might land a Hollywood studio in hot water on a grassroots level in China. That I imagine a lot of executives are going to be working to avoid that, while still trying to do whatever they can to preserve access to their theaters.
And I can't wait to see how this all plays out. Thank you all for joining us today. Remember, it's Red Carpet by Erich Schwartzel. It's a great book. We hope to see you for your next one.
Yeah, the sequel.
The sequel.
We'll franchise this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.